Tonight, the Prime Minister puts UK defence on a war footing to tackle an axis of autocracy. £500 million for Ukraine and tens of billions more for the military in the UK, as Rishi Sunak hails the biggest strengthening of our national defence in a generation. Is it enough? Can it be delivered? And what are the implications for other areas of government spending? I'll speak to the former Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey. We'll also hear from Labour's Sophy Ridge, who's told me that a Labour government would match the Prime Minister's pledge. Also tonight, 5 people die and around 50 more are rescued from the English Channel, hours after the government's Rwanda bill passes. And as a skirmish breaks out at a St George's Day event in London, can politicians reclaim the flag from extremists? All that and more with Baroness Sayeeda Warsi and Jacqui Smith, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Tuesday, I'm Sophy Ridge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. According to the Defence Secretary, the Shadow Defence Secretary, the head of the army, we're no longer in a post-war world, we're in a pre-war world. Russia, China, the war in the Middle East, things feel a lot more dangerous and unpredictable now. And you can understand why military chiefs think we need to be on a war footing as a result. That's why today the Conservatives have committed to spending 2.5% of our GDP on defence by 2030, and what the Prime Minister is calling the biggest strengthening of our national defence for a generation. And tonight, Labour's Sophy Ridge has told me the Labour Party will match that. Now, that will cost £75 billion, according to the government. £75 billion. To put that in context, the entire annual schools budget is £60 billion. So this is a huge spending commitment, and honestly, I'm really not sure how it's possible to find £75 billion down the back of the sofa. After the war in 1948, we managed to afford the creation of the welfare state by winding down defence spending. And right now, it does feel like politicians are just not being honest about the difficult choices that will be necessary if we really do want to get back on a war footing today. So our first report comes from our political editor, Beth Rigby.
The Prime Minister touching down in Poland, flanked by his Chancellor and Defence Secretary, off the plane and on a war footing with money and a message. Europe's at a turning point. This, the front line of Europe's war. The Prime Minister at a Polish military base, shoulder to shoulder with NATO's Secretary-General and his Polish counterpart, Donald Tusk. Coming together as they contemplate a more dangerous world, and the PM offering more money for more of this. £500 million to help halt Putin at Poland's border. And that just the start of a much bigger defence spend.
Today I'm announcing the biggest strengthening of our national defence for a generation. We will increase defence spending to a new baseline of 2.5% of GDP by 2030. That starts today and rises steadily in each and every year. Over the next 6 years, we'll invest an additional £75 billion in our defence. And it will be fully funded with no increase in borrowing or debt. Today is a landmark moment in the defence of the United Kingdom. This is a generational investment in British security and British prosperity. It makes us safer at home and stronger abroad.
A sign of the times this PM feels we're living in, harking back to the man who led us through the Second World War.
As Churchill said in 1934, to urge the preparation of defence is not to insert the imminence of war. We did not choose this moment, but it falls to us to meet it.
Question for you both, please. You talk about Europe being at a turning point and this spending put in the UK on a war footing. Have we entered a pre-war era?
And I quoted Churchill earlier. I think we have to recognise that the world, as I said, is in a more dangerous place than it's been since the end of the Cold War. Now, this is not something new. What is new is, I think, the pace and intensity of where we're seeing these threats emerge.
We are safe as long as we stand together. I cannot tell you exactly what the next crisis or the next war will be, but what I can tell you is that if we stand together, we will be able to protect and preserve peace for NATO allies.
On St George's Day, here we are.
This PM mindful of voters at home too. As threats increase, so does the cost of peace. But his first priority clear. The security of his citizens matters above all else. Europe's at a turning point and the UK's defence industry is on a war footing. The Prime Minister here in Poland with a clear message. He will be a strong leader in dangerous times. But there's a domestic play here too. He has now announced that defence funding his party so longed for, and the hope will be it might appeal too to some lapsed Conservative voters, all quite handy ahead of the local elections.
That's what makes all the difference.
And questions now for Labour, which has promised to lift defence spending to 2.5% of GDP as soon as resources allow.
I fully support what the Prime Minister has announced in relation to further funding for Ukraine. It's vitally important that we continue to support Ukraine against Russian aggression. And in Parliament, in our politics, we've stood united on the question of Ukraine since the conflict began. We will continue to do so.
Thank you.
As our enemies grow, alliances matter all the more. The Prime Minister making a big commitment on defence spending now. Whether he has to deliver it is another question as we eye that general election. Beth, Rigby, Sky News, Warsaw.
Beth, Rigby there. Well, Rishi Sunak's pledge was up until 2030, most of which could, in theory, be a time of a Labour government. I've been getting reaction from the Shadow Environment Secretary, Steve Reid.
Well, Keir Starmer has called for precisely that already.
What?
Yes.
2.5% by 2030?
2.5% as the target we need to get to, because that is part of our obligations.
By 2030?
That is part of our obligations as a member of NATO. So that is what Labour would be working towards as resources allow, is what Keir said.
But this is that was previously the Conservatives' position as well.
Yes.
You've said when conditions allow.
Yes.
Now, today, the change is the government saying they want to do it by 2030.
Correct.
Do you want to match that? Would you do it by 2030?
Yes, Labour would want to match that. I think what we see is escalating threats to the security of our country, and the primary objective of any government surely is the defence of the realm. We're seeing the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin. We're seeing what's going on in the Red Sea and the Middle East at the moment. We're seeing a resurgent and increasingly threatening China as well. Britain needs to make sure that we are secure, but also that we are playing our part within the NATO alliance and meeting our obligations for 2.5% of GDP within that. Now, I'm glad that Rishi Sunak has said what he's said. I'm disappointed that that's not what the Conservatives have been working towards for these past 14 years, because they've actually reduced the army by 40,000 troops since they were elected. We now have the smallest army since the Napoleonic Wars. Now, all well and good for Rishi Sunak belatedly to see that defence of our country is important, but I'm interested to see how he proposes to find the money to fund this, and then we can look at that, scrutinise that, and take a view about the feasibility of it.
So just to be crystal clear, you've said you would like to see Labour match what the Conservatives have said today. So you would like Labour to commit to saying you'll spend 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030.
That's right. That's
Correct.
part of our NATO obligations. But we need to look and see how Rishi Sunak is proposing to fund this, so we can take a view on that. I haven't seen that yet, any more than you have.
No, I haven't.
And really, the Prime Minister hasn't actually published that information. I'm sure it will come out over the following days and weeks. So the right thing to do would be take a step back, have a look at those numbers when they come out, and assess the feasibility of what he's telling us.
But, I mean, you've just committed to it as well, so, surely you must think it is feasible if you're both committing to 2.5% by 2030.
We were already committed to getting to that figure as resources allow.
When conditions allow. That's very different, let's be honest. We're talking about £75
but
billion here. I mean, just to put that in context, the core schools budget is about £60 billion. How are you going to find that money?
Well,
I'll ask the same question to the Conservatives.
Let's have a look at, the government has got proposals for this, that they haven't published that yet. We need to have a look at those proposals and then we can take an assessment on the feasibility of what they are saying they want to achieve. But I think the objective is right. We're seeing heightened threats to this country's security. You could talk about all of the other things that we want to do within this country, but if the country's not safe and secure, none of those things can be done.
Yeah.
So the defence of the realm must come first. We'll look at what the Conservatives are proposing. We'll comment on those.
At the same time, and I absolutely take your point about the defence of the realm, about the fact many people believe we're in a pre-war world, but the scale of the decisions that would be needed to get to an extra £75 billion on defence, more than the entire schools budget, is huge. I mean, we managed to create the welfare state because defence spending was wound down after, the World War. And what are we going to do this time round? How do we get to put this country on a war footing in terms of defence spending while also keeping public services? How do we do that?
Labour has a plan for economic growth that we believe will help to fund this. The Conservatives have been watching the economy flatline and even shrink.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in seeing what Rishi Sunak says about how he's going to fund that, given what he's done to the economy. Our plan for growth gives us the opportunity to meet those targets, but that is why Keir Starmer said, as resources allow.
I mean, everyone wants growth, don't they?
Well,
Conservatives want growth.
The Conservatives haven't delivered growth.
Reform want growth. Labour want growth.
But the economy grew 50% faster every single year under the 13 years of Labour government than under these 14 years of Conservative government. So we know we can grow the economy faster. We have a plan for growth. The Conservatives have given up.
OK.
So let's see.
You're launching your rural crime strategy today. What's the plan?
Well, the issue behind this is crime in rural areas has shot up by 30% since the Conservatives came to power. I've been getting out in rural communities a lot recently, talking to farmers, talking to landowners, talking to people that work in the countryside as well. And they tell me they never see a police officer anymore. And there are forms of crime that are unique, perhaps, to the countryside that are simply being ignored. Now, Labour's got a plan to tie up procurement against the police forces to generate enough savings to fund at least 13,000 additional neighbourhood police officers.
You said that there's some crimes unique to the countryside, and often, when we're thinking about crime, we think about cities, we think about urban crime. Do you think that there's a bit of a bias there?
Well, it's gone up faster in rural areas, hasn't it, than in urban areas, although, of course, it's gone up in urban areas as well. So they seem to have failed everywhere. But I think there is a particular problem with rural areas, and there are different forms of crime. I was speaking to a sheep farmer recently, absolutely distraught at the fact that there were people coming with XL bully dogs, setting them loose on the sheep and lambs to train them to be more aggressive because they're training them to fight. Now, it's horrific to think of her animals being killed in that way. It's a huge loss of value to her in people coming and doing this. But she was telling me that she phones the police, they don't even come. There aren't enough police to be clear about that. So the 13,000 additional officers that we can put out on the streets will respond to people like that. But we have to stop treating crime in rural areas as an afterthought, just because it's not as visible to so many, perhaps, of the media. It's debilitating to rural areas. They deserve to be kept safe as well. And Labour's plan to tackle rural crime shows that we are on the side of those people who want to take back control of their streets in our rural communities.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Steve Reid.
Thank you, Sophie.
Labour's Steve Reid there telling me that Labour would want to match the Conservative commitment to get to 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030. Bit of a difference of emphasis, shall we say, or policy, others might say, than Keir Starmer in Beth Rigby's report, saying that Labour wants to get to that target, but only when economic circumstances permit. Now, it has been picked up, I have to say, by the former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. He's taken to Twitter, or X, I should say, copying in John Healey, the Shadow Defence Secretary, saying, "Have a word, John, he isn't sticking to the script." Well, let's bring in now our Security and Defence Editor, Deborah Haynes. What is Labour's policy?
Well, I mean, it's become even more key given the Prime Minister's announcement today. Labour came out and said that they will increase to 2.5%, matching what Rishi Sunak had said, but in the same way as the previous Prime Minister, as his previous policy was, it was caveated with if Labour's borrowing rules allow, whereas the Prime Minister had said as soon as fiscal conditions permit. That's now been removed by the Prime Minister. It seems to have been removed by that shadow minister you just spoken to, but that's not yet, it doesn't seem to be official policy from the Labour leader, but pressure will now be on him to clarify this position, because it's very clear from everybody inside defence and externally looking at the threats that the UK's armed forces is massively underfunded. It's got huge capability gaps. It's just today, with this new announcement of weapons to Ukraine, they've dipped once more into the army cupboard and raided the shelves and given a lot, almost everything it almost seems, to Ukraine. And so clearly there is an absolute critical urgency to replenish the stockpiles, to put, as the Prime Minister said, the defence industry on a war footing. But to do that, it needs money. And if you look at the small print from today's announcement, the only new money, because the Prime Minister said in his announcement that it's starting right now from today, this new increase, but the only new money this fiscal calendar is £500 million, and that's going to Ukraine. So there's no new money from today for the UK Armed Forces. There is this commitment to, like you said, £75 billion over the next 6 years, but that we won't really start seeing that until after the election. And so then it's a big question as who is going to be in charge then. And clearly that creates a dilemma for defence chiefs who are absolutely trying to plough ahead with plans, but it's difficult to do that without proper budgets.
Absolutely right. Deborah, thank you very much indeed. Deborah Haynes there. And I will be getting some more defence more reaction, I should say, to that defence announcement from the man who was Armed Forces Minister until last month. That is James Heappey. We'll be hearing from him shortly after 7:30. Right, let's bring in our panel for this evening, shall we? The former Cabinet Minister, Baroness Sayeeda, and the former Home Secretary, that is Jacqui Smith. Great to have you both on the programme today. Right, we're talking defence. Sayeeda, do you agree with this commitment to reaching 2.5% by 2030?
I do, and we have to be on a pre-war footing. And the reason we have to be on a pre-war footing is because if we look across the world, increasingly we see that we have to be in that space because diplomacy is failing. Look, we go to war when diplomacy has failed. And if we look at what's happening in Russia, what's happening in the Middle East, the way in which the United Nations Security Council has been operating, the way in which actually across the world governments are paying less regard to an international rules-based system, then increasingly we're going to have to find ourselves in these spaces where we're going to have to fight it out on a battlefield. And I hope what this government and any future government that comes in does is not only commit to a backstop position of making sure that we are on a war footing and that our armed forces are properly and fully funded, but also start to take up our place on the world stage and make sure that we continue to give diplomacy a chance.
How about you, Jacqui?
I agree with Sayeeda, and of course part of making these commitments from both Labour and the Conservative Party is to maintain our place on the world stage. Having left the EU, how do we maintain our international role? Well, we have always used defence as a way of doing that, as well as, of course, of recognising that the first role of any government is to secure the country. The real challenge, however, the political challenge that you've identified is it's easier to make a commitment. Well, we've almost seen a sort of arms race of political declarations today as people have tried to outdo each other. I'm sure we'll want to think more about how that's actually going to be paid for.
On the arms race of political declarations, it feels to me like Labour have been very, very careful not to make spending commitments. They've kind of danced around the defence. They said, yes, we absolutely want to raise it, but only when economic conditions allow. And then Sophy Ridge's gone in there and said, yep, 2030, we're going to match it.
Well, Labour have got two problems, haven't they?
Did he mean that, do you think?
There are two challenges for Labour. One of them is not to be outflanked on defence, which is why, of course, Keir Starmer was the first person to say, we want to get to 2.5% when finances allow that to happen. The other challenge they have, of course, is the fiscal discipline that Rachel Reeves has with iron discipline imposed on them, it's quite difficult to square those two things today. But they are both essential, actually, Labour would believe, in order to win the next election.
I mean, this is the difficulty, though, isn't it? £75 billion. I mean, the annual school budget is £60 billion, and there's really no discussion today about how this money is going to be found.
There isn't, but I also think that this is a direction of travel, and what the government is doing is really signalling this is where we would like to go, and we hope that a future government will continue to go in this direction. And I think that Labour saying, yes, of course, we're going to keep heading in the right direction is the right thing to say. But I also think that it's not just about money, it's about innovation, and there was a lot of discussion from the Prime Minister today about that, about the way in which more of a budget is going to go to research and development. It's going to be about looking at how we're looking at the use of drones more often. So I think it'll be the advancement of technology.
It's about money as well. It's committed £75 billion of public money. I mean, that's an enormous amount.
I think you can see Sayeeda and I can't quite answer the question about where the money's going to come from today, as nor can anybody else. But it's also about spending it in the right place, which is why John Healey has also said there will be a strategic and defence review within the first year of a Labour government in order to identify where you can most effectively use, hopefully, the resource that they're able to find.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we'll get a reaction to the death of 5 people, including a child, in the English Channel, hours after the government's Rwanda bill passed. Donald Trump has left the courtroom after the second day of his hush money trial, calling it unconstitutional and unfair. And as skirmishes break out at a St George's Day event, we'll discuss the pitfalls of politicians wrapping themselves in the flag.
Breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. शांति से इनको समझाओ वरना ये हम लोग It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders, and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. What is feared that over 200 people might have died because of these landslides. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. This is one of the most sensitive areas of northeast Delhi where there's been clashes. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Welcome back to the Politics Hub. The Prime Minister has pledged £500 million of new funding to Ukraine and said he would increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. 5 people have died in the Channel during an attempt to reach the UK hours after Parliament passed the controversial Rwanda bill. And Donald Trump has called his hush money trial unconstitutional as he left from the second day of proceedings. And former president said it was unfair that he couldn't speak freely while others could say what they wanted. You can stay up to date with all of the goings-on in Westminster on our digital politics hub by scanning the QR code at the bottom of your screen. Among the other stories we've been covering that you can read about today include the Welsh Transport Secretary issuing new guidance on the introduction of 20-mile-an-hour zones in built-up areas. Decisions will now be left to local communities after the policy provoked strong opposition. And the Irish Prime Minister, Simon Harris, has apologised on behalf of the state to the families of the 48 victims who died in the Dublin Stardust fire tragedy. That's in 1981. Government borrowing was £6.6 billion higher than expected in the last financial year, casting doubt on the Chancellor's ability to cut taxes again ahead of the general election. Now, Rishi Sunak's controversial Rwanda bill finally passed through Parliament in the early hours of the morning. Hours later, though, tragedy struck once again in the Channel. 5 people, including one girl, died trying to make the crossing on a crammed small boat. Here's our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons.
Celebrating as they head towards Britain, nearly 60 migrants on an inflatable dinghy with chaos and tragedy in their wake. Many were not meant to be on this boat. We're told dozens rushed aboard at the last moment, like these men in blue jackets, hijacking the boat, pushing the number to 112 passengers. It was too much, and when the boat hit a sandbar, people fell in, and a major rescue operation was triggered. Most were saved, but 5 died, 3 men, a woman, and a small girl. For Sandrine, the grief was personal. She recognised the child who died, knew her family.
I saw them bringing in the bodies on stretchers, and I saw the little girl who I knew. Her father fell into my arms, and I said to myself, this can't be possible. She's a child. They tried to resuscitate her. The helicopters arrived, but she died. And then there were 4 other bodies.
Abandoned on the promenade, the soaking clothes of those who perished.
112 migrants, c'est du jamais vu. Donc il y a eu vraiment une volonté peut-être dans un
112 migrants is unheard of, so there was a real desire, perhaps because of the improved weather, to increase the number of people in the boat, with dire consequences which we deplore this morning.
sur le bateau avec les conséquences malheureuses que l'on déplore.
The coastal roads full of activity, more migrants led away by police after further failed crossings. But many do succeed. Remember the men in blue jackets. Here's their boat in UK waters as a British lifeboat escorts them to England. The number of small boats crossing the Channel is up, and already we've seen more deaths than we did in the entirety of 2023. That's why the government says it needs the Rwanda legislation as a deterrent. For some of these people, the UK is a last hope of claiming asylum. Like these migrants we spoke to, many had tried to settle elsewhere in Europe and told us they were threatened with deportation.
Everyone wants to go to UK. Why? Because we have a problem. European country deport. Yeah, deport. In here, deport.
So you have to leave France?
Yes, France, Deutschland, but deport.
The Rwanda legislation will now enable the government to send people like this to Africa, but there's little sign here it would be a deterrent. You think that Britain would not send you to Rwanda? That wouldn't happen?
No, Rwanda, no. Rwanda, Africa.
No,
Rwanda, Africa, no good. No safe.
You think life would be a lot better in the UK?
Yes.
This coastline is long and wavering, and it's hard to police. Overnight, 5 smugglers were arrested, but at dawn, we filmed a series of boats, all setting off to cross the Channel. There is no sign here that the flow is slowing. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Wimereux.
It's just unbearably sad, to be honest. You know, just imagining the little girl, how frightened she must have been. I find it one of those stories actually very difficult to cover. But I guess you kind of have to put that to one side and think, what can we actually do to try and stop these tragedies happening? What can we do? I mean, Jacqui, what's your view on it?
Well, it's the tragedy that makes me even more angry about the efforts that have gone into pursuing the Rwanda bill, which I just genuinely don't think will solve that problem, and has taken an enormous amount of money, which actually I think would have been better spent bolstering the cross-channel and European police powers, cracking down, therefore, and using terrorist-like powers if necessary in order to crack down on the smugglers and the organised criminals who are putting people into those boats in the first place. And then, of course, making sure, because even if flights take off to Rwanda, and I've said on the podcast for as long as the government have been proposing it, that there won't be any. I think there may be one or two now before the election, but the maximum number of people that would go to Rwanda would be 1% of those that are still waiting to have their asylum claims determined. So the other part of the answer is determine people's asylum claims quickly. If they've got a right to stay in the country, allow them to work and live and become integrated. If they don't have a right to be in the country, remove them much more quickly than is the case at the moment. That would act as a deterrent for people who didn't have the right to be here. And if they have the right to be here, allow them to be part of our country much more quickly.
What's your view on Rwanda?
I couldn't agree more, actually, with Jacqui. If you look at the numbers, the number of people that, even if the plan was to work, that we would be removing over a period of 5 years, it isn't even a fraction of the number of people who are arriving within the first couple of months of a year. So the solution, even if it was to work perfectly, will only be a tiny part of the overall solution. And I think the Rwanda bill has now become about political posturing rather than a practical solution, and the only way you'll get people not to be dying in the channel, which is the tragedy of all of this, will be to come up with a practical solution. It should not be a party political issue. It should be an issue in relation to the long-term sustainability of what a migration policy for the United States.
It is difficult though, isn't it? Because if you look at Interpol's reports on people smuggling and trafficking, they admit that it's a really, really difficult thing to police because people have these very sort of temporary relationships with the people smugglers. They have temporary mobiles, it's difficult to find them. I mean, you listen to some people's sort of ideas for just cracking down on the gangs. It's harder than that, isn't it?
Well, it's very hard. It doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't lend itself to a political slogan. That's the problem. And so that's why you need careful, international, resourced operation in order to cope with it. Of course it's difficult. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of organised criminals who are working extremely hard to keep themselves away from the authorities. But I do believe that there's more that we could be doing, and there's more that we could be doing to improve the whole operation of how quickly we make our asylum decisions. But it ain't going to go on a poster and win you a general election. That's the problem.
Thank you both very much indeed, Sayeeda and Jacqui. Coming up on the Politics Hub this evening, the Prime Minister has pledged billions more for defence and another £500 million to Ukraine. But is it enough? I'll speak to the former Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey. And as we mark St George's Day, we'll discuss whether politicians are right to wrap themselves in the flag. Hello, welcome back. Well, as we were hearing earlier, the Prime Minister's used a visit to Poland to make a significant pledge to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Now, it comes amidst growing concerns that Western nations are not putting their money where their mouths are when it comes to security. So we thought we'd just take a moment and look in a bit more detail at how much the UK, US and Germany are spending on defence and also on helping Ukraine. So we're spanning back to 1985, and the defence spending for these countries as a percentage of GDP back then was near to double what it is today. The level of defence spending gradually dropping over the last 37 years. There was a bit of an uptick around here, so 2009, 2010, that's around the time of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, turning to aid sent to Ukraine from January 2022, the beginning of the Russian invasion until January this year, you can see the US there have given just over £49 billion in support, significantly more than the UK and Germany, who have spent £13 and £18 billion respectively to help President Zelensky's campaign. Now, these figures don't take into account the recent announcements by the UK and the US. So the UK today pledging a further £500 million in aid to Ukraine, so taking their total contribution up to nearly £14 billion. But the US House of Representatives have agreed on an additional £49 billion worth of aid packages over the weekend. So that takes their total contribution to just over £107 billion, just to put that all into context for you. Now, defence spending is sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and Annabel Denham, the Deputy Comment Editor at The Telegraph. Well, joining us now is James Heappey, who until last month was the Armed Forces Minister. Great to have you here in the studio this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So, Rishi Sunak's pledged to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. You must be pretty pleased. That's what you're calling for.
Yeah, I am. I mean, to be clear and to get the punch in first, I'd been saying that we should go further, and I think over the next decade or so there is a conversation about that. But I think it'd be really churlish on a night when we're reflecting on the biggest increase in defence spending that a government has made in my lifetime. £75 billion additional onto the MOD's budget in the rest of this decade, and at the expense of other things. And in an election year, a Prime Minister will more naturally move towards, he could have announced a £40 billion on hospitals, £20 billion on schools, £15 billion on roads, or £75 billion on tax cuts. And instead, he's gone to Poland, stood in front of our armed forces and said he's going to spend that £75 billion on defence. I think that's a sign of the times that we're living in, but also a reflection of his priorities for the country.
So just to be clear, you think we need, more, sooner?
Well, look, I think what 2.5% will do, and it is urgently needed, and that's why this announcement is unreservedly welcome, celebrated, and the way people in the MOD...
Yeah, we've got that.
Very, very vivid.
Welcome it.
What 2.5 will do is allow the current armed forces, the Army, Navy, Air Force, at its current size, to be correctly enabled, i.e. the kind of engineers, the medics, the logistics, to have the stockpiles, to put our defence industrial base onto a sort of permanent manufacturing scale that underpins our kind of strategic resilience and our ability to supply the force in war. So all of that is fantastic. Anybody who thinks that 2.5% is going to bring with it a growth in the Navy or a growth in the Air Force or a growth in the Army doesn't really understand just how expensive all this stuff is. And in time, I can see the need to have that conversation. But it would be so churlish. I think deeply, sometimes in politics, it's so easy to just tear everything down, demand more, this isn't good enough, or sort of... this is one of those days where the Prime Minister phoned me first thing this morning before he went to Poland, and he told me what he was going to do, and I was genuinely gobsmacked. I didn't think, if I'm honest, in an election year, defence would end up being the priority, and it is, and that's fantastic. That's the correct decision.
As you admit yourself, it's quite expensive, right?
Hugely.
The defence spending. £75 billion spending commitment. And to put that into context, the entire annual schools budget is £60 billion. I don't understand how this is going to be funded. Have you just found the money down the back of a sofa? Has it?
No, I mean, and look, the conversation I had with the PM this morning was too brief for me to authoritatively relay to you how he's doing it. But what he mentioned to me was the proceeds of a series of efficiency measures that have been taken thus far and that would be taken over the course of the next Parliament, none of which I think sounds unpainful, but reflects
efficiency measures sound. Well, that sounds great. That sounds like cutting back on a bit of photocopying in the cabinet office.
No. I suspect much more profound.
Austerity.
Well, I know I wouldn't want to go that far.
£75 billion.
But I think, Sophie, there is this reality. If we live in a world that is ever less stable, ever more unsafe, and the threat to the UK interest is real, and it's not just the army that I served in a decade or so ago, where that threat was faced in dusty and dangerous places half a world away. This is now a threat here in the Euro-Atlantic, a threat to our near abroad and even to our homeland. I think there is just this reality that defence, exactly as if you had shown the graphs you showed just now and showed juxtaposed against it spending on other domestic priorities like health, education, whatever else, you would have seen that defence was the priority. I suspect that the geostrategic situation demands that is the reality we have to go back to.
Look, people who know a lot more about this than me say this money is needed, right? That we're in a pre-war world, that things are getting very, very dangerous, that we need to keep this country safe. I guess my point is politicians aren't being honest about what the difficult decisions are that are going to allow us to find £75 billion more to spend on defence. I mean, thinking back to, 1948, when the welfare state was created, we were able to do that because we were winding down defence spending after the war. How are we going to get back onto a war footing, as the Prime Minister seemed to say, and perhaps you believe is necessary, while keeping public services? We can't, can we?
I think, absent any firm evidence to the contrary, I'm inclined to take the Prime Minister's brief discussion with me at face value, that he has headroom to do this. But even then, that is still an incredible choice. This is a Prime Minister choosing to eschew things that would be more politically attractive in an election year in favour of defence spending. And I think that is brave, correct, but brave.
Well, he's not saying it's not that brave if he's not saying what the difficult choices are.
No. I think he is, because even if he had the money as sort of headroom, which is what he indicated to me was the case, he's still making the choice not to spend it on other things. Now, if it is the case that we're going to have to fund defence better at the expense of other public services, clearly that is painful. And there'll be plenty of people who, after 40 years of peace dividend, would not accept that that is the priority. But fundamentally, the first responsibility of any government, of any political persuasion, is the defence and security of the realm. And if we face a geopolitical environment that is worsening and the threats to the UK interest around the world and here at home are growing, then any responsible government has to respond to that, no matter how painful the decision may be, with increased investment in our defence and security.
Talk about painful decisions. You've announced you're standing down at the next election. You've quit as the minister. How are you feeling about it all? Sad, liberated?
Well, I mean, on a day like today, I would have liked to have been in the MOD. I suspect there'll be a lot of people who would feel like their work had been recognised by the Prime Minister, and it would be nice to be able to celebrate that with them. On other weekend, the previous weekend, 3-4 months ago, I'd have been reading intelligence all week. You'd have had that horrible sense of dread of what was to come as you knew Iran was going to launch that attack. You forward positioned troops, therefore you had taken a decision to put RAF pilots in harm's way, and that may or may not have worked. And the consequence come Sunday morning could have been a regional war or worse. So I don't miss the gravity of those discussions that were the kind of routine business of the last 4 years. But I do miss working with such an amazing group of people, both the MOD, civil service and our nation's armed forces. What an amazing job for 4 years to be able to work with them.
OK, thank you very much indeed, James Heappey,
on
the programme. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Run it up the flagpole and see who salutes. Should politicians be proud to wave the flag this St George's Day?
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock, as 5 people die making the perilous journey to the UK in an overcrowded boat, we'll hear from migrants on both sides of the channel. Plus, Wales puts the brakes on its 20-mile-per-hour speed limit. We'll ask if 20 really is plenty. And pounding the pavements and the Pinot, we'll hear from the marathon runner with an unorthodox approach to hydration.
With lockdown, which it has an impact on a lot of things, people felt that they needed a dog as a companion because they were isolated. So during that period of time, there was an extra 4 million dogs bought. So before lockdown, we had about 8 million dogs in this country. After lockdown, we have 12 million. Now, a lot of these have bought dogs because of what they like the look of, or it suits their personality or type or whatever. Unfortunately, when I first started working with XL bullies, many, many years ago, as an expert witness under the Dangerous Dogs Act, I used to assess these dogs. They were quite reasonable. They were very, very reasonable. But what happened in about 2021 to 2022 is the bloodlines of varying other things changed. And because of that change, suddenly we found an enormous amount of more deaths. In fact, 4 times more deaths in 2022 than we'd ever seen over the last 30 years. 75% of all the deaths between 2021 and end of 2023 were down to XL bullies that did that attack, including a lot of other attacks that didn't end up in fatality. They wanted a different bloodline. There's a particular bloodline, and it's been said that over 50% of all the dogs in Great Britain are part of this particular XL bullies bloodline, Kimbo, over in America, and they transferred his sperm over here. They've been messing about with DNA and variant other things. And Kimbo, unfortunately, was a result of a pairing between a brother and sister. These dogs were bred initially for fighting, so they have a preponderance towards aggression in that case. A lot of these dogs have been very, very good, but some of these bloodlines, and in particular that one, Kimbo, is an absolute monster. It really is.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub, and happy St George's Day, an occasion for displaying national pride. Today did also see an example, though, of how the flag can be associated with the political fringe. Skirmishes broke out at a St George's Day event in central London. The Metropolitan Police released footage showing a group of men, some draped in St George's flags, clashing with officers in Whitehall. Now, the Met had earlier warned that those attending the event were expected to include far-right groups and groups linked to football clubs travelling from elsewhere in the UK. Well, in contrast, the political class has been draping themselves in the flag, metaphorically speaking, I should say, throughout the day. Rishi Sunak had it's a bit of a low-key offering, to be honest. It was just, I think you can't even see it. There we are, a little mug with the St George's Day cross on it. Keir Starmer, though, well, he really went to town. He released a whole 2-minute video, perhaps a reaction to previous criticism of Labour under Jeremy Corbyn not being sufficiently patriotic.
The symbol of St George, the St George's flag, belongs to every person who loves this country and seeks to make it better. A symbol of pride, celebration, belonging and inclusion. So on behalf of the Labour Party, I wish everyone a happy St George's Day.
Really going there, Keir Starmer. Now, the relationship between politics and the England flag hasn't always been straightforward, I think it's fair to say. Let's get the thoughts of Sayeeda and Jacqui. I remember, I'm old enough to remember Emily Thornberry and the going into a bit hot water with the St George's flag.
But the reason why people were so cross with Emily for doing that was precisely because even at that point, we were trying to, well, less so with Jeremy Corbyn, to be fair, we were trying to reclaim the flag in exactly the way that I think we need to. That what I take from that horrible bunch of blokes fighting with a flag around them is we can't allow people like that to believe that the flag represents the views that they are espousing. So, you know, I'm proud of my country. I'm proud to be English. I'm proud to be British. I'm proud to be European. And depending on the event, happy to wrap a flag around me.
Yeah, I'll
not
be getting
quite
it
as
out
happy
of,
as Sayeeda is, as I.
Yeah, Sayeeda. I think we've got some.
You got a picture of me draped
Hopefully,
myself
you can see
in a flag. I mean, if you look back to the kind of. Well,
there
you go. You see, that is literally me draped in a flag at a party at Downing Street.
That's a great outfit, I have to say. I love it. There we go.
Yeah. I'm sorry you're not wearing it tonight.
Exactly. I should have turned up with it. Because, look, growing up, Sophie, in the kind of 70s, 80s, where the St George's Cross was very much adopted and, you know, taken on by the far right, and so many people associated with far-right extremism and racism, I think what we did do effectively during the Olympics initially, but thereafter in terms of the football and sports has really been a way in which people of all backgrounds and colours have re-embraced cricket, you know, have re-embraced the St George's flag. And as I keep reminding people, you know, St George was actually brown. I mean, I wish I'd gone out onto that protest of white angry men and said, guys, you do realise St George was actually brown. He was half Palestinian and half Turkish, so get over yourselves. And it might have been a bit of a reminder that St George, who is our, you know, the English patron saint, is somebody who's celebrated across the world and is, you know, is relevant in so many people's lives. So I really hope that politicians will continue to, you know, drape themselves in the flag and own it.
It does feel like we've got a bit better at this, actually. I mean, I'll get my St George's flag out for the Euros. Like you say, it's around the kind of sporting events, I think, that it's easier to kind of reclaim.
It's why people were so cross. It wasn't all confected about the football shirt and the Nike changing the nature of the flag, because we had got to a position where actually we all felt quite comfortable about the flag and quite proud of it.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Do you think... I mean, it was interesting, wasn't it? Keir Starmer really went to town on the video today. Rishi Sunak was a little bit more restrained, but still, you know, had a smug with pride. Do you think it's something that politicians, I guess, are trying to... They know that it goes down well with voters?
They do, but I also think that we have to be clear about what we mean by patriotism. Patriotism is about being proud of what your country is. It's about making sure that the vast majority of us feel included in the process. It's about saying that, look, you know, we value our institutions, democracy, the rule of law. I think the bit that I worry about is some of my colleagues who project as patriots or pretend to project as patriots, but actually fight culture wars and therefore pit community against community, because true patriots don't do that. So it's not just about wrapping yourself up in a flag, it's about making sure that the language that you use in politics is inclusive. It's about making sure your policies...
Any examples that you'd give of that then? Who do you mean?
I don't think there's any doubt about who I mean. If you look at the last Home Secretary and some of the language that she's used and the way in which she's divided communities and the way in which she's pitted community against community and some of that rhetoric about who belongs and who doesn't belong and who's the in-group and out-group, I think any politician who fights culture wars cannot then say we are patriotic, because what they're basically saying is we're setting our country alight.
I'm just going to go straight to the US, if I may, just because otherwise we're going to run out of time, but thank you both very much indeed, because we've had day 2 of Donald Trump's trial. The judge has been considering whether to hold the former president in contempt of court or fine him for social media posts that prosecutors say have broken a gag order. Now, as he left court a little earlier, Mr Trump said the trial was unconstitutional and unfair. Well, we can speak now to Donald Trump's biographer, Michael Wolff, who's giving us his expertise throughout the trial. What's been happening? Hopefully you can hear me. What's been happening today?
Sorry about that. I was we're out front of the courtroom and it's very noisy out here. There were 2 things that happened today. There was the hearing on the prosecutions. The prosecution has asked the court to hold Donald Trump in contempt for his social media posts. So that happened this morning. The arguments on that. And the interesting thing about that was how weak the defense response was. I mean, almost embarrassing. And at one point, the judge said to Mr. Trump's lead lawyer, "You have lost all credibility with me." So the interesting thing then is to speculate if that lawyer is going to lose all credibility with his client, Donald Trump, who is very hard on all of his lawyers. The second part of the day was the testimony of David Pecker. David Pecker was the publisher of the supermarket tabloid, The National Enquirer, which and he's the phrase catch and kill, which has gotten a lot of attention during the Trump years, but specifically in this trial. So he's the executive who was the author of that, who willingly, or at least the prosecution maintains, entered into a conspiracy with Donald Trump to pay for stories that might be damaging to Trump and then not to publish them. And that is the focus of this trial. They entered into this kind of conspiracy and committed fraud in how they recorded this in their business records, the Trump organization.
OK, Michael Wolff, thank you very much indeed for keeping us up to speed with the extraordinary events that we're seeing play out there in New York. Thank you. Well, that is it from us tonight. Thank you for watching. I'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Up next, it's the UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee. I'll see you tomorrow.